the day was destroyed by a rose. One of the richest men in Rome led an army into the desert because he wanted glory. Marcus Licinius Crassus already owned more money than most kings. His houses, mines, slaves, contracts, and political debts stretched across the republic like hidden chains. He had purchased influence, crushed enemies, lent money to ambitious men, and survived the most dangerous decades of Roman politics with the cold patience of a banker who understood that fear could be counted like coin. He had once helped save Rome from Spartacus. He had stood beside Pompey in triumph. He had shared power with Julius Caesar in the uneasy arrangement that held the republic together, while also poisoning it from within. But wealth was not enough. In Rome, money could buy votes, houses, gladiators, judges, informers, banquets, and silence. It could not buy the thing Crassus wanted most: the kind of military legend that made citizens lower their voices when a man's name was spoken. Pompey had conquered in the east and returned with kings in his shadow. Caesar was carving his reputation into Gaul, sending reports back to Rome that turned forests, rivers, and tribes into steps toward immortality. Crassus had power, but in the world of Roman ambition, power without battlefield glory felt unfinished. So he looked east. Beyond Syria lay Parthia, a kingdom of horsemen, nobles, walled cities, open deserts, and royal roads stretching toward the old wealth of Mesopotamia. To many Romans, Parthia seemed like the next prize. It had no single shield wall waiting on a familiar field. It had no city whose capture alone would end the war. But it had gold, prestige, and the reputation of a great eastern power. If Crassus conquered it, he would not merely be rich. He would return as the man who had opened the road beyond the Euphrates, the Roman who had matched or surpassed Pompey's eastern fame. The idea sounded grand in political conversation. On the ground it began as heat, dust, bad omens, and men marching away from the world they understood. The Roman Republic was not calm when Crassus made his move. It was a machine running hot. Elections could become street battles. Alliances were sealed by marriage, money, and fear. Laws were passed for ambition as often as for justice. Caesar needed time and legal protection while he fought in Gaul. Pompey wanted authority without appearing to destroy the republic openly. Crassus wanted a command that could finally make him a conqueror. Their arrangement gave each man something, but it also left each watching the others for signs of advantage. Crassus received Syria. For a cautious governor, Syria would have been a frontier to manage. It offered wealth, cities, tax revenue, trade routes, and a dangerous boundary with Parthia. For Crassus, it became a platform. He arrived in 54 BC and began collecting money, troops, supplies, and information. Temples and local treasuries felt the pressure of Roman demands. Provincial communities understood that the new governor's eyes were not fixed on administration but on a campaign. He had come east not to hold a line but to cross it. Some Romans disapproved. A war against Parthia did not have the clean excuse of defense. It looked like an act of personal ambition, wrapped in the language of Roman destiny. The tribune Attius Capito, according to later accounts, tried to block Crassus as he departed and pronounced curses against him when he failed. The scene would later become part of the legend of the disaster. The old commander leaving under religious darkness, warned by men, signs, and gods, yet moving forward because ambition had already closed around him. Crassus was not moved. Ambitious men often treat warnings as insults. Advice becomes doubt. Doubt becomes weakness. Weakness becomes something to punish by success. The more voices questioned the expedition, the more victory promised not only glory over Parthia, but revenge against critics at home. If Crassus returned triumphant, every hesitation would sound foolish. If he failed, the warnings would become prophecies. The army he assembled looked powerful in the way Roman armies often looked powerful before the first mistake. 7 legions formed its iron heart. Around them moved auxiliary troops, light infantry, cavalry, engineers, servants, pack animals, officers, merchants, and local guides. Roughly 40,000 men, depending on how one counts the attached support, were drawn into the expedition's shadow. The numbers mattered to Roman confidence. A legionary line had broken enemies from Spain to Greece, from Africa to Gaul. The system was not imaginary. Roman infantry could march farther, dig faster, endure more, and fight with greater discipline than most opponents could bear. But every military system has a preferred language. The Roman legion spoke the language of weight, order, engineering, and close decision. Its soldiers could build a fortified camp after a march. They could throw pila to disorder an enemy line and then close behind shields with short swords. They could rotate ranks, obey signals, and hold ground. In rough country or against infantry, these habits made them terrifying. Against an enemy who refused close contact on open ground, those same strengths could become frustrated muscle. Parthia spoke another language. Its power rode on horses. Parthian nobles could appear in heavy armor as cataphracts, men and mounts protected by scale or mail. Long lances held with the force of shock. Around them moved swarms of horse archers, riders trained to shoot while moving, retreat while killing, and make distance feel like a wall. Their bows were composite weapons, compact enough for cavalry and strong enough to send arrows into armor, shields, limbs, and exposed faces. They did not need to stand still to be dangerous. They did not need to accept a Roman invitation to close battle. The man who would bring this system against Crassus was Surena. He was not the Parthian king, but he was powerful enough to move with royal gravity. Young, immensely noble, and commanding private resources that astonished even ancient writers, Surena belonged to the highest level of Parthian aristocracy. He had helped place Euphrates II on the throne, and now he carried authority westward against Rome. Stories describe his wealth, servants, baggage, and personal magnificence, but at Carrhae his luxury was less important than his judgment. He understood that the Roman army did not need to be smashed by a frontal charge. It needed to be held in the wrong place until its strengths stopped mattering. Surena did not bring a mirror image of Crassus's army. He brought a tool made for the ground. His horse archers could harass and encircle. His cataphracts could threaten decisive impact. His supply arrangements could keep arrows moving. His scouts could measure Roman progress. His commander's mind could refuse the battle Crassus wanted and manufacture the battle Crassus feared too late. If the Roman infantry could be drawn into open terrain, away from secure water, away from broken ground, and away from reliable allied cavalry, then the result might not depend on Roman bravery at all. There were better roads for Crassus than the one he chose. The Armenian king Artavasdes offered him an alternative. March through Armenia, he advised. The terrain would be harsher, but it would reduce the usefulness of Parthian cavalry. The mountains and broken country would give Roman infantry more security. Armenian cavalry and local support might strengthen the campaign. A less direct route might save the army from being surrounded on plains where mounted archers could turn every direction into danger. This was not cowardly advice. It was strategic advice. Crassus rejected it. He wanted speed. He wanted a direct advance into Mesopotamia. He did not want to share control with an allied king, slow his campaign, or appear hesitant before an enemy he had come to conquer. A commander seeking a careful frontier war might have accepted Armenia. A commander chasing a legend wanted the straight road. The straight road led toward the open country Surena could use. The crossing of the Euphrates turned intention into commitment. A river crossing always changes an army. On one bank, retreat still feels imaginable. On the other, every mile creates a debt. The legions crossed from the Roman sphere into a region where intelligence thinned and local loyalty could not be trusted. Men watched the water move behind them and knew that the road home now had an obstacle across it. Pack animals, cavalry, standards, baggage, camp followers, and troops moved east under the pressure of command. The expedition became real not when Crassus announced it, but when the last men stepped onto the far bank and kept marching. Roman religious practice marked such moments. Sacrifices, auspices, and rituals were not decoration. They were part of how the Roman mind measured danger. Later accounts preserved disturbing signs around Crassus's departure and crossing. Mistakes in clothing, bad omens, ritual failures, and words that sounded too much like death. Modern readers may treat these as inventions added after disaster, but armies do not experience omens as footnotes. A soldier who hears that the gods are uneasy carries the thought under his shield. Crassus marched anyway. Early progress encouraged him. The enemy did not immediately appear in overwhelming force. Local voices suggested that the Parthians were retreating or disorganized. A ruler often identified as Ariamnes or Abgar influenced Crassus, urging speed and directing the Romans toward open ground. Whether he was consciously treacherous, opportunistic, or simply part of the fog of unreliable frontier politics, his guidance helped pull the army into the landscape where Roman confidence would be tested most severely. The legions moved through heat and distance. The desert near Carrhae was not empty in the way maps can make it appear. It had villages, routes, wells, patches of cultivation, low rises, and spaces known intimately by those who lived there. But to Roman soldiers from Italy, Gaul, Spain, or the Balkans, it could feel like a widening uncertainty. Dust-coated lips, sweat-soaked tuniques beneath armor, leather straps rubbed skin raw. Water became a thought that returned again and again. Men who could joke during early marches became quieter as the sun rose and the horizon refused to change. The army's shape became important. A Roman column on the move is not the same as a Roman line in battle. Baggage must be protected. Cavalry screens must report. Officers must keep intervals. Men must be ready to form quickly if the enemy appears. In friendly territory, the machinery of marching can be routine. In hostile open country, every adjustment carries risk. Stretch too far and units lose support. Compress too tightly and movement slows. Chase too eagerly and cavalry can be isolated. Halt too often and morale decays. Crassus's son Publius rode with him. Publius Licinius Crassus was more than a beloved heir. He had served under Caesar in Gaul, where war was fast, brutal, and full of improvisation. He had seen cavalry action, tribal warfare, and the kind of campaigning that made young aristocrats into real officers. Caesar had sent Gallic cavalry with him, men who had proved useful in Western war. Publius brought energy the army needed. To the soldiers he represented youthful courage. To Crassus, he was blood, ambition, legacy, and reassurance. No father planning victory imagines the enemy will use his son as a message. As the Romans approached Carrhae in 53 BC, scouts began to report contact. The information was confusing, which was exactly the condition in which bad decisions grow. Parthian forces were nearby. Their numbers were difficult to judge. Dust concealed movements. Some reports suggested only a limited enemy force. Others were more alarming. Crassus had to choose a formation before he understood the full design around him. He first considered a long line that might prevent encirclement and maximize frontage. Then, under pressure and advice, he formed a more compact square-like arrangement. Infantry facing outward, baggage protected, cavalry assigned to positions. This was not irrational. Against surrounding cavalry, a dense all-around formation could prevent sudden collapse. It made the army a moving fortress. But a fortress made of men still has nerves, thirst, wounded bodies, and time working against it. The Parthians appeared. At first they did not reveal their full visual power. Coverings concealed armor. Dust softened edges. The Roman eye could not yet measure what it faced. Then Surena ordered the coverings removed. Sunlight struck helmets, scales, horse armor, and weapons. Cataphracts glittered like moving metal. Horse archers spread across the plain. Drums began to thunder, deep and harsh, a sound less like music than like the earth being struck from below. The Romans heard it through helmets, through dust, through expectation. Then the arrows came. The first wave did not decide the battle. It defined it. Horse archers advanced, shot, turned, and moved away before the legions could answer effectively. The arrows fell from the front and sides. They struck shields with a sound like hard rain on wood. Some punched through. Others found exposed thighs, hands, throats, cheeks, feet, and shoulders. Men lifted shields higher, then felt pain below. They lowered shields, then heard arrows crack into helmet rims. A soldier could crouch, but he could not disappear. A formation could hold, but it could not stop being a target. Roman light troops tried to respond. They moved forward to drive off the archers, but the Parthians had range, speed, and space. The light infantry could not force contact. Roman missiles could not control the cavalry. The horsemen drew back, shifted angle, and returned. The first Roman attempts to push the enemy away showed the central problem of the day. Rome could hurt what it could reach, and Parthia did not intend to be reached. Crassus's men expected the arrow storm to end. This expectation was reasonable. A quiver empties. A rider cannot shoot forever. An army that spends missiles must eventually withdraw or close. Roman discipline was made for endurance. If the legions held, if shields stayed up, if officers kept order, perhaps the Parthians would waste their arrows and be forced into a more familiar fight. Men told themselves this because it made the pain part of a plan. Hold long enough, wait them out, let Eastern impatience break against Roman steadiness. Then the camels appeared. Surena had brought a supply train loaded with arrows. Camels moved behind the lines, bringing fresh missiles to the horse archers. The sight carried more terror than its simplicity suggests. The Romans were not enduring a limited barrage. They were inside a system designed to continue. The arrows would not stop because the first quivers emptied. The storm had logistics. A legionary who understood that felt the day lengthen before him like a sentence. The Roman square tightened. Compression can protect, but it can also punish. Packed men have less room to avoid missiles. Wounded soldiers fall against comrades. Officers struggle to move through ranks. Shields collect arrows until they become awkward to handle. The wounded cannot be evacuated easily without opening gaps. Blood under sandals makes footing treacherous. The smell of dust mixes with iron, sweat, and fear. Every man hears the cries of others and wonders when his own voice will join them. Surena's cataphracts added another pressure. They did not need to charge constantly. Their presence changed Roman choices. If the infantry loosened too much, armored cavalry could strike. If Roman cavalry moved rashly, it could be drawn into danger. If units advanced, they risked being isolated. The cataphracts waited like a door that would close when the archers had done enough. Their lances gave shape to the threat that arrows had softened. For hours, Rome was forced to defend without deciding. This is one of the cruelest conditions in battle. Soldiers can endure fear if action gives it direction. Advance, hold, charge, build, retreat, carry, cut, push. But to stand and receive injury from an enemy beyond reach is a different torment. It makes discipline feel like captivity. The men of Crassus's legions were not weak. Their endurance under arrow fire was astonishing. Yet their courage was being spent in a currency the Parthians had chosen. Crassus needed to change the battle. He ordered Publius to lead a force forward, cavalry, including the Gallic riders, archers, and selected troops. The goal was to drive away the horse archers, force contact, and relieve the main army. This was not a foolish desire. An army cannot let itself be killed passively forever. Publius had the aggressiveness for such a move. His Gallic cavalry had fought hard in Caesar's wars. They were not men likely to sit under arrows until death arrived politely. They charged. For a moment the Roman side saw hope move across the field. Publius and his riders pushed out through dust and missile fire. The Parthians ahead of them gave ground. The retreat looked real enough because every successful trap must resemble opportunity. The Gallic horsemen spurred forward. Roman officers watched from the main formation, trying to measure distance through haze. The pursuing force moved farther from support, and with every stride the space between father and son widened. The Parthians kept retreating until Publius was isolated. Then the shape of the fight changed. Horse archers turned on the Roman detachment from multiple directions. Cataphracts appeared where a path back should have been. The Gallic cavalry, brave and aggressive, found themselves facing enemies who did not stand still long enough to be punished. Charges struck air or small groups that slipped away. Arrows cut into horses, wounded mounts through riders. Men who tried to close with cataphracts found long lances and armored horses waiting. The sortie, meant to restore Roman action, had entered a smaller version of the larger trap. Publius tried to hold a rise. The ground offered a slight advantage, enough for men to gather, but not enough to save them. Some dismounted. Some formed around standards. The wounded clustered in the center. Gallic horsemen fought with desperate physical courage, at times grabbing Parthian lances, hacking at armored riders, and trying to drag enemies down by hand. Their world was close combat. The Parthian world was distance. The two worlds met briefly and brutally, but the arrows kept coming. Publius was wounded. His force was surrounded. Return to the main army was impossible. Surrender meant humiliation and perhaps torture, while death in battle still preserved a Roman shape of honor. According to the tradition, Publius ordered a companion to kill him. The companion obeyed. Around them the last pockets of resistance were overwhelmed. The Parthians cut off Publius's head and carried it back toward Crassus's army. The main Roman formation did not immediately know the full truth. They saw Parthian riders returning. They saw dust movement and perhaps captured standards. Hope can survive in fragments. Maybe Publius had forced a withdrawal. Maybe the enemy had been hurt. Maybe the pressure would ease. Then the Parthians displayed the head. It was not only a trophy, it was a weapon aimed at the commander's heart and the army's morale. Crassus had to see or hear that his son was dead. His soldiers had to understand that the attempt to regain initiative had failed catastrophically. The Gallic cavalry were gone. The young officer connected to Caesar's western victories had been destroyed in the Eastern Open. The army now had fewer cavalry, fewer options, and a commander struck by personal grief in the middle of a public crisis. Crassus tried to speak. Ancient sources describe him urging the soldiers not to let his private loss become the army's ruin. He reportedly told them that his son's death was his own misfortune, while the Republic remained theirs to defend. Whether the exact words are accurate or shaped by later moral storytelling, the moment itself was real. A father had to convert grief into command before men who were still being shot apart. Some soldiers may have been moved. Others may have seen only that the gods, fortune, and tactics had all turned against them. The Parthians renewed pressure. Now the arrows carried a second meaning. Each impact said that no rescue was coming from Publius. The Roman cavalry could not clear the field. The army could still survive if it held until night, but survival had shrunk from victory to escape. Men who had crossed the Euphrates dreaming of eastern conquest now measured success by the possibility of reaching a town alive. Evening finally approached. Surena did not need to throw cataphracts into a needless night fight. He had achieved enough for the day. The Romans were wounded, demoralized, stripped of much cavalry, and forced into retreat. Darkness, which might have favored Roman escape, also carried danger for everyone. Parthian horse archers did not need to spend themselves blindly. The killing could continue tomorrow if the Romans remained within reach. When the arrows slackened, the battlefield did not become peaceful. The wounded filled the silence. Men called for water. Men asked whether Publius was truly dead. Men begged comrades not to leave them. Surgeons worked with limited time and little hope. Officers faced the awful arithmetic of retreat. The army could not carry every wounded man. If it remained in place, the Parthians would resume the attack. If it moved, men unable to walk would be abandoned. Battles do not end when weapons pause. They continue inside decisions that no victor sings about. Crassus ordered a withdrawal toward Carrhae. The night march was a second disaster in another form. Units moved in darkness, trying to remain quiet while wounded men groaned and equipment clattered. Some commanders kept order. Others struggled. Men who had stood all day under arrow fire now had to move with thirst, shock, and grief. The stars gave little comfort. The enemy might appear at any moment. The town of Carrhae promised walls, but the road there forced the army to pass through the consequences of its own defeat. Many wounded were left behind. This was not because their comrades had no pity. It was because pity had weight. A man who cannot walk requires carriers. Carriers slow a column. A slowed column can be surrounded at dawn. Some wounded begged for death rather than capture. Some were given it. Others were abandoned with water, words, or silence. For survivors, the memory of those voices may have lasted longer than the arrows. The Romans reached Carrhae. Walls, even small ones, change the feeling of a defeated army. They create edges. They give men corners, gates, towers, shadows, and the illusion of control. Inside Carrhae, the survivors gathered, counted losses, and confronted what remained. Crassus had not been annihilated in the first day, but his campaign had lost its offensive purpose. He could no longer conquer Parthia. He had to save what could be saved. The options were bad. Staying in Carrhae would invite siege, hunger, and eventual surrender. Retreating toward Syria risked pursuit across open country. Moving toward Armenia might offer rougher ground, but only if the army could reach it and if guides could be trusted. The men were exhausted. Officers disagreed. Local leaders offered advice whose loyalty was uncertain. A defeated commander must choose among roads that all look like traps. During the confusion, some Roman forces escaped separately. One officer, Cassius Longinus, would survive and later become an important figure in Roman politics. Others slipped away by night, or moved with enough discipline to avoid total destruction. But many remained with Crassus, and his ability to command had been weakened. The men no longer saw him as the conqueror who would lead them to wealth. They saw him as the man who had brought them to Carrhae. Trust, once damaged in an army, is difficult to repair quickly. Crassus attempted to retreat again under cover of darkness. The plan was to move towards safer ground, perhaps into hillier country where Parthian cavalry would have less freedom. But the movement became confused. Guides misled or failed. Units became separated. Some accounts describe deliberate treachery by local leaders. Others suggest the ordinary chaos of a broken army moving through unfamiliar land under pressure. Either way, Surena's advantage grew. The Romans found themselves near unfavorable ground, tired and surrounded. Parthian forces pressed them. The remains of the army could still fight, but another full day under arrows might finish them. The men were desperate. They had seen what resistance in the open meant. When Surena offered negotiation, it sounded to many like the only door left. Crassus was reluctant. Roman commanders knew that talks under enemy pressure could become traps, but his own soldiers urged him to meet. The pressure from his men mattered. A commander cannot save an army if the army no longer believes refusal can save it. Crassus went to the meeting. The scene was tense before it began. Romans and Parthians did not share assumptions about honor, surrender, personal safety, or symbolic gestures. Each side watched hands, horses, weapons, and faces. Surena wanted submission or at least the appearance of it. Crassus wanted a way out that did not look like disgrace. Around them stood men whose patience had been cut thin by thirst, fear, and suspicion. The meeting collapsed. Accounts differ. There may have been argument over mounting a horse. A Roman may have feared Crassus was being seized. Hands reached for weapons. Voices rose. In the sudden crush, negotiation became violence. Crassus was killed along with officers nearby. The richest man in Rome died not in a clean duel, not in a triumphant assault, and not as the master of events, but in confusion after his choices had left him dependent on an enemy's terms. His head and hand were taken. Later tradition claimed that molten gold was poured into his mouth, a savage symbol of greed. Whether the act occurred or was invented by moralists, it survived because it fit the story people wanted to tell. Crassus the rich man, Crassus the ambitious man, Crassus the man who wanted Eastern glory, died with wealth turned into mockery. Yet to reduce Carrhae to a fable about greed alone is to miss the battlefield. Greed sent him east, but tactics destroyed him. After Crassus's death, the Roman army broke into final fragments. Some soldiers were killed, many were captured. Others escaped in small groups, carrying news that no one in Syria wanted to hear. The expedition that had begun as a conquest ended as a collection of survivors, prisoners, severed command, lost standards, and rumors moving westward. In Roman terms, the disaster was not merely human, it was sacred and institutional. Legionary standards had been taken. The visible honor of Rome had fallen into Parthian hands. The captured standards mattered deeply. A Roman standard was not just a marker for soldiers to follow. It embodied the unit's identity, pride, and relationship to the state and gods. To lose one was shame. To lose several in a disaster beyond the Euphrates was a wound that could be displayed by the enemy and remembered by every Roman politician who spoke of the East. Even men who had never seen Carrhae could feel dishonor in the thought of eagles held by Parthians. Parthia had achieved more than a victory. It had shown that Rome could be stopped at the frontier of a different kind of war. The Republic could conquer kingdoms, destroy cities, and grind down stubborn enemies, but it could not simply carry its infantry system everywhere and expect the world to obey. The Euphrates became not only a river but a warning. Beyond it, cavalry, distance, and local politics could turn Roman aggression into exposure. The political consequences reached Rome. Crassus had been one of the three men balancing the Republic's unstable power. With him dead, the relationship between Caesar and Pompey became more dangerous. The triumvirate had already been strained by ambition, jealousy, and death within family alliances, but Carrhae removed a major counterweight. A battlefield far in the east helped loosen the last bolts holding Roman politics together. Within a few years, the Republic would move towards civil war. Caesar kept winning in Gaul. Pompey remained in Rome, increasingly tied to the senatorial order and increasingly suspicious of Caesar's power. Without Crassus, there was no third giant with enough weight to complicate or balance the rivalry. The death of an army in the desert did not cause the Roman civil war by itself, but it changed the structure in which that war became likely. Carrhae sent more than bones back west, it sent absence. Surena's triumph did not protect him forever. Parthian royal politics could be as deadly as Roman ambition. A commander who won too much glory might threaten the king he served. Ancient tradition holds that Euphrates later had Surena executed, perhaps out of jealousy or fear. If true, the irony is sharp. The man who destroyed Crassus by understanding power in the field may have been destroyed by power at court. Victory over Rome did not make him safe inside Parthia. This adds another edge to the story. Carrhae was not a simple clash between disciplined Rome and exotic Parthia, between greed and punishment, or between infantry and cavalry. It was a meeting of political systems as much as military ones. Crassus fought for status inside a Roman competition. Surena fought for a king whose gratitude had limits. Soldiers on both sides bled beneath ambitions that would continue consuming men after the battle ended. For captured Romans, the aftermath was a different kind of unknown. Some were reportedly settled far to the east, perhaps in Margiana, though later legends stretch the evidence further than certainty allows. What matters is that many men who had left the Mediterranean world under Roman standards ended in places their families could barely imagine. A legionary might survive the arrows only to vanish into captivity, marched across lands whose languages he did not speak. He had not died at Carrhae, but Rome had still lost him. For survivors who returned, memory had to be carried carefully. A defeated soldier lives inside questions. Why did the commander choose that road? Why did the cavalry ride out? Why did the arrows not stop? Why were the wounded left? Why did the gods allow the standards to fall? Such questions do not remain private. They enter taverns, camps, families, and political speeches. Carrhae became a story Rome told in fragments. Crassus's greed, Publius's bravery, Parthian arrows, treacherous guides, lost eagles, Eastern humiliation. But the military sequence is clearer when stripped of excuses. Crassus sought glory in a theater where his army needed caution. He rejected a route that might have reduced the enemy's advantage. He crossed into terrain where cavalry dominated. He allowed unreliable intelligence to shape movement. He faced an enemy commander who understood how to combine horse archery, heavy cavalry, missile supply, and psychological pressure. He sent his most mobile force forward, and it was isolated. After that, the campaign became a retreat under enemy control. Each step made the next worse. This is how many disasters are built. Not by one foolish moment alone, but by a chain that tightens gradually. Ambition chooses the war. Pride chooses the route. Bad intelligence chooses the ground. Enemy skill chooses the tempo. Pressure chooses the sortie. Grief weakens command. Night forces abandonment. Desperation chooses negotiation. Violence ends what judgment began. The Parthian method at Carrhae deserves respect because it was not effortless. Horse archery required training from youth. Riders had to control mounts with knees and balance while shooting in motion. They had to judge distance, wind, speed, and target behavior. They had to avoid being caught by sudden charges. They had to rotate, resupply, and maintain cohesion across a wide field. Cataphracts required wealth, armor, strong horses, and discipline. Camel supply had to be placed correctly. Surena's army was not a cloud of random raiders. It was a coordinated system. Roman contempt for Eastern enemies made the lesson harder. Romans often described opponents through moral categories: soft, luxurious, treacherous, barbaric, undisciplined, or inferior. Such language comforted conquerors. Carrhae punished comfort. The Parthians might dress, fight, ride, and rule differently, but different did not mean weak. Their refusal to fight like Romans was not cowardice, it was strategy. Their distance was not fear, it was control. Publius's death became the emotional center of the disaster. The younger Crassus had the qualities his father wanted the campaign to display: courage, energy, connection to Caesar's victories, and the promise of future honor. His charge gave the army a brief answer to helplessness. His isolation revealed the trap. His severed head broke morale. In a story full of political ambition and tactical systems, Publius gives the disaster a human face: a son riding away under his father's order, and returning as proof that the battle had changed forever. The common soldiers give it scale. They are less named in the sources, but they carry the weight of the event. A centurion trying to hold ranks while arrows thudded into shields. A legionary pressing his shoulder against the man beside him, because the formation had become the only world left. A cavalryman realizing his horse was dying under him. A wounded auxiliary hearing the order to retreat and knowing he could not walk. A standard-bearer trying to keep the eagle upright while men around him fell. These are the pieces from which defeat is actually made. The battlefield itself also shaped the story. Open ground made Roman infantry visible and reachable. Heat and thirst magnified pressure. Dust obscured movement. Distance allowed Parthian riders to manage contact. Lack of strong terrain denied the Romans a secure anchor. Carrhae was not only armies colliding, it was a place being used by one side better than the other. Surena made the landscape part of his command. When later Romans looked back, they had to decide what kind of lesson to draw. Some lessons were practical. Never neglect cavalry in the east. Never trust open ground against horse archers. Never assume missile supply will run out. Never march deep without secure intelligence and allies. Other lessons were moral. Greed destroys judgment. Omens should not be ignored. Old men should not seek youthful glory, and the gods punish arrogance. Both types mattered because Rome was a military culture and a moral storytelling culture. Carrhae fed both. Decades later, Augustus recovered the lost standards through diplomacy. He presented the return as a restoration of honor. Coins and monuments celebrated what looked like revenge without battle. The standards came home, but not the dead. The political value of their return shows how long Carrhae remained alive in Roman memory. A symbol lost in 53 BC could still serve imperial propaganda in 20 BC because the wound had never fully closed. By then the republic Crassus had known was gone. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, ruled, and been assassinated. Civil wars had followed. Augustus had emerged from the wreckage as master of a transformed Roman state. The world that received the recovered standards was not the world that had lost them. In that sense, Carrhae belongs to the end of the republic not only as a foreign defeat but as part of the unraveling of the men who dominated it. Before the army ever saw Parthian armor, the campaign had already changed the lives of thousands of ordinary people in Syria. A Roman expedition did not move on courage alone. It consumed rope, nails, leather, grain, oil, pack animals, spare sandals, tent cloths, spear shafts, writing tablets, medical tools, and money. Local villages supplied what they could not refuse. Merchants followed because soldiers spent coin before and after danger. Muleteers cursed at loads heavier than promised. Armorers repaired hinges and shield rims. Scribes counted rations and names. Officers checked lists and lied to themselves about how clean those lists were. Every great campaign begins with paperwork before it becomes blood. Crassus's wealth helped him think in terms of acquisition. He had spent his career turning resources into leverage. In Syria, he treated the province as a reservoir for a campaign whose benefits would belong largely to him. Men who disliked him later emphasized his greed in collecting treasure from temples, especially at Jerusalem, where he was said to have taken sacred wealth. Such stories darkened his reputation even before Carrhae. Whether every accusation was fair in detail, the impression was powerful. Crassus was gathering not only soldiers but the moral weight of plunder before victory had justified it. The soldiers saw the eastern frontier differently from senators in Rome. Some wanted loot, some wanted land after service, some wanted pay, some followed because obedience was the shape of their lives. Veterans judged commanders by food, discipline, luck, and whether a man seemed to understand roads. Newer recruits judged by confidence because they had little else. Many would have known of Pompey's success in the east and Caesar's reports from Gaul. If Rome had defeated so many peoples, why should Parthia be different? A few men had served long enough to mistrust easy comparisons. They knew that enemies were never identical. Spanish hills were not Greek plains. Gallic forests were not Syrian roads. A tribe that charged shouting was not the same as a cavalry kingdom that measured distance by horse. These older soldiers might have watched the preparations with tighter mouths. They might have asked about water, scouts, cavalry numbers, and the reliability of guides. They might have sharpened Pila without enthusiasm. The army's cavalry arm was one of its silent weaknesses. Roman infantry was excellent, but infantry alone cannot command open country against horsemen. Crassus had cavalry, including Gallic riders under Publius, but not enough of the right kind to dominate the field ahead of him. He needed screens, reconnaissance, pursuit capability, and the ability to prevent Parthian archers from choosing every angle. He had brave mounted men, but bravery was not the same as operational equality. Against Surena's horse army, the Roman cavalry would be asked to solve too many problems at once. The legions still trusted their own routine. Each evening, if time and conditions allowed, Roman soldiers could build a camp with ditch and rampart. This habit was one reason Rome had conquered so effectively. The camp turned a marching army into a temporary fortress. Men knew where to sleep, where to cook, where standards stood, where officers could be found, where animals were held, and where danger would first appear. Order could be dug into the earth, but the day of Carrhae would not give them a camp before the killing began. It would give them open ground. Surena's preparations were less visible to Roman eyes but just as deliberate. He had to decide how to confront a force whose infantry, if allowed to close, could be lethal. He did not need to surround the Romans immediately in a dramatic cinematic gesture. He needed to control their options. Horse archers would begin the reduction. Cataphracts would keep the Romans from dismissing the cavalry as mere skirmishers. Arrow supply would destroy the hope that endurance alone could win. Psychological display would unsettle before physical exhaustion completed the work. The drums mattered because battle begins before impact. Roman soldiers were used to horns, trumpets, commands, and the rising roar of armies. Parthian drums produced a different kind of sound. Deep instruments, perhaps kettle drums or hollow resonant devices, could create a continuous thunder that confused distance and scale. A man inside a helmet might not know how many enemies were moving, only that the air itself seemed to carry their confidence. Sound was part of Surena's first assault. The reveal of armor mattered too. When the Parthians removed their coverings, they turned uncertainty into intimidation. The Romans had heard reports of Eastern riders. Now those reports became shining metal on men and horses. Cataphracts did not need to charge instantly to serve their purpose. They showed the legions that the enemy had more than light archers. The Romans would not simply endure arrows and then brush aside fragile cavalry. Behind the arrow storm waited armored force. On the Roman side, command became a series of shrinking choices. Crassus could not easily retreat as soon as he saw the enemy. A withdrawal under mounted pressure might turn into immediate collapse. He could not easily advance because the Parthians could avoid contact. He could not remain forever because arrows and thirst would do the work of swords. He could not send out all cavalry because the main body would be stripped of protection. He could not send none because passivity would murder morale. Every option contained a blade. The soldiers inside the formation experienced these choices only as orders, delays, and pain. A man in the center might not see the enemy clearly. He would hear arrows striking the outer ranks and wait for his turn to move or die. A man on the edge saw too much. Riders approaching, the flash of bows, the curve of arrows, the bodies of friends turning at strange angles when hit. Centurions walked lines where they could, barking at men to keep shields locked and not waste missiles. Standard bearers tried to remain visible, because in confusion a standard was a small piece of the world that still made sense. Water became a private obsession. No Roman account needs to say every soldier was thirsty for us to know it. Armor under eastern sun makes thirst inevitable. Fear dries the mouth. Dust thickens spit. Wounded men ask for water because pain burns. Officers hesitate to distribute too much because no one knows how long the fight will last. A man can think of Rome, honor, pay, gods, and family, but when his tongue swells and his lips crack, the mind returns to the water skin. The Parthians used time as carefully as arrows. A quick charge might have satisfied pride, but it would also have given the Romans the close struggle they understood. Instead, Surena allowed minutes to accumulate into damage. 10 arrows became 50, 50 became hundreds. The first wounded became obstacles. The first dead became warnings. The first failed response became doubt. Time did not pass neutrally on that field. It belonged to the side that could kill while waiting. When Publius rode out, the Roman army's emotional balance shifted with him. Men wanted him to succeed because his movement gave them something to believe in. The main formation could imagine the enemy archers being scattered, the pressure lifting, the battle turning into pursuit, the day becoming difficult but recoverable. Publius carried not only cavalry but the army's need for the battle to change shape. That made what followed more devastating. The Gallic riders under him deserved their own place in the story. They had come from a different war. In Gaul, cavalry engagements were often violent, personal, and fluid, but they still offered chances to close. Gallic nobles and horsemen valued visible courage. A charge meant identity as much as tactics. At Carrhae, their courage met an enemy who could reward courage with distance. A Gallic rider might spur toward a Parthian archer, feel the gap closing, raise a weapon, and then watch the target slide away while another arrow struck from the side. This was not cowardice by the enemy, it was denial. As Publius's force moved farther out, terrain and dust separated experience. From the main Roman position, the sortie became shapes and noise. From Publius's position, the main army became unreachable mass behind haze. This separation is crucial. Armies break not only when men die, but when groups stop sharing the same understanding of the battle. Publius's men may have believed for a time that they were pushing the enemy. Crassus may have believed his son was still applying pressure. Surena knew the distance was growing useful. The moment the Parthians turned on Publius was not a simple ambush from hiding. It was the closing of a moving trap. Riders who had retreated now angled inward. Horse archers found firing positions. Cataphracts appeared to block bold exits. The Romans and Gauls were not killed in one instant. They were compressed into a desperate defensive posture. Horses, the source of their mobility, became liabilities when wounded. Dismounted cavalrymen are often men deprived of their proper weapon. They can fight, but they cannot do what they were sent to do. Publius's last stand also damaged Crassus before the head returned. Every minute without relief increased dread in the main army. Officers had to decide whether to send more help, but sending more could repeat the isolation. The formation could not simply abandon position and rush forward because Surena's main pressure remained. The father was forced to wait while the son vanished into tactical distance. That waiting was part of the cruelty of the battle. After Publius died, the Parthians understood the value of display. A severed head in ancient warfare was not only brutality, it was communication. It could announce a leader's death faster than words. It could break the illusion that a missing force might still return. It could make private grief contagious by showing it to thousands. When Publius's head was raised before the Romans, the battle entered a new stage. The enemy was no longer just killing bodies. It was attacking the story the Romans needed in order to keep standing. Crassus's response, whatever its exact wording, had to perform several tasks at once. He had to appear steady after seeing his son's death. He had to prevent soldiers from interpreting the sign as divine abandonment. He had to remind them that retreat was not yet destruction. He had to keep his officers functioning. He had to do all this without the cavalry strength his plan had just lost. A commander has no private face in such a moment. Even grief must wear armor. The Romans held until evening because discipline still lived. This should not be overlooked. A lesser army might have disintegrated after the cavalry sortie failed and the commander's son was displayed dead. The legions did not. They remained dangerous enough that Surena chose not to end the matter with reckless shock. That decision reveals the respect hidden inside his method. He did not confuse Roman suffering with Roman softness. He kept using the tools that worked. The retreat to Carrhae carried the moral ruin of the day into darkness. Leaving wounded men behind was not a single order shouted once. It was repeated in small scenes across the field. A soldier trying to lift a friend and realizing he could not keep pace. A centurion forcing men forward while avoiding the eyes of those on the ground. A wounded man offering a ring, a belt, or a name to carry home. A comrade promising to return though both knew no return was possible. War histories often count casualties after battle. The men inside a retreat experience them as voices fading behind. Carrhae's walls gave temporary structure to men who had lost the field. Inside the town, arguments sharpened. Some wanted immediate flight, some wanted to wait. Some believed the Armenian direction offered hope, some trusted local guides, some trusted no one. The chain of command had been damaged not just by casualties but by confidence. Crassus still held rank, but his aura had been pierced. An army that doubts its commander hears every alternative more loudly. Cassius represented a different survival instinct. Gaius Cassius Longinus, who would later play a role in Roman history far beyond Carrhae, urged caution and eventually escaped with a portion of the forces. His survival matters because Carrhae did not erase every Roman in one stroke. Disasters are uneven. One group finds a road, another loses a guide. One officer keeps enough discipline, another hesitates. These differences shape who lives to tell the story and who becomes part of the number. For the men still with Crassus, the final retreat turned the campaign into a maze. Night, hills, fatigue, uncertain guides, and Parthian pursuit combined to strip away the last clean choices. When an army no longer knows the road, every suggestion becomes dangerous. The very thing Crassus had lacked from the beginning, reliable local control of terrain, now became decisive. He had marched into a geography where the enemy could interpret the land better than he could. At the end, the land continued serving the enemy. The negotiation with Surena was born from this exhaustion. Modern readers may wonder why Crassus agreed to meet after so much evidence of danger. But men trapped in military collapse do not choose from perfect options. Another battle could mean slaughter. Continued flight could mean piecemeal destruction. Surrender might preserve some lives. Officers and soldiers around Crassus pressured him because they were thinking not of reputation but of survival until the next hour. A doomed negotiation can look before it fails, like the last rational act. When violence broke out at the meeting, the campaign lost its final center. A living Crassus could still be blamed, obeyed, exchanged, ransomed, or used. A dead Crassus became a conclusion. His death transformed the remaining Romans from an army under failed command into fragments of a catastrophe. The Parthians had no need to let the story remain ambiguous. The head in hand confirmed the fall of the man who had brought Rome east. The humiliation was staged beyond the battlefield. According to ancient tradition, Crassus's severed head was later used in a performance of Euphrates' Bacchae at the Parthian court. a grotesque fusion of theater and victory. Whether this detail is exact or embellished, it shows how the Romans imagined the insult, their commander reduced to an object in foreign celebration. Defeat was not only death, it was the enemy possessing the power to narrate your ending. Rome hated that. A republic built on public honor could absorb casualties more easily than mockery. Romans had lost armies before and recovered. What made Carrhae poisonous was the combination of poor judgment, Eastern humiliation, lost standards, and Crassus's personal reputation. It was a defeat enemies could laugh at and moralists could use. It gave every political opponent a simple shape for condemnation. The rich man reached too far and fed legions to arrows. But again, the soldiers deserve more than to be props in Crassus's moral failure. They marched because armies march. They formed because officers ordered formation. They held because training held them. They suffered a kind of warfare many had never imagined in full. When they died, they did not die as examples. They died as men in heat and dust, holding shields toward moving riders, and waiting for a command that could return the world to sense. The Parthian victory also had limits. Surena destroyed Crassus's army, but Parthia did not immediately roll west into Syria and permanently seize Roman territory. Operational brilliance in one campaign did not create an empire stretching to the Mediterranean. Rome's frontier bent but did not vanish. Cassius and others helped stabilize what remained. This distinction matters because Carrhae was a devastating defeat, not the end of Roman power. Its significance lies in the limit it revealed, not in a total collapse that did not occur. Roman adaptation would be slow and uneven. Future commanders understood better that Eastern campaigns required cavalry, allies, supply planning, and respect for distance. Yet Rome's attraction to the East never disappeared. The wealth and prestige remained too tempting. Emperors and generals would return to Mesopotamia again and again, sometimes winning, sometimes overreaching, often learning that occupation and victory were not the same thing. Carrhae became the first great warning sign on a road Rome kept trying to travel. There is a final cruelty in Crassus's desire for comparison. He wanted to stand beside Caesar and Pompey as an equal in military fame. In a sense, he succeeded in becoming unforgettable, but by inversion. Caesar's name evoked conquest, civil war, dictatorship, assassination, and transformation. Pompey's name evoked Eastern victories, political grandeur, defeat, and murder in Egypt. Crassus's name became fused with Carrhae, wealth, ambition, desert arrows, and a death that made his fortune seem useless. He entered memory not as the conqueror of Parthia, but as the man Parthia used to teach Rome caution. That kind of fame is a punishment ambition rarely imagines. The mechanics of the killing were simple enough to describe and difficult to endure. A Roman shield was a superb object for the wars Rome preferred. The large curved scutum could protect the body, lock into a line, and help a soldier push through panic into contact. Against a javelin exchange followed by close combat, it gave the legionary the courage to advance. Against arrows falling for hours from shifting angles, it became both shelter and prison. A man behind it could survive 1 shaft, 10 shafts, perhaps 50 strikes near him, but he had to keep holding. His left arm burned, his shoulder cramped, his vision narrowed to the rim of the shield and the feet of men near him. He was alive, but his world had shrunk to wood, leather, and impact. Armor created another paradox. Mail, helmet, greaves, and fittings saved many lives. They also trapped heat. The better protected a man was, the more the desert worked on him. Sweat ran but did not cool enough. Thirst deepened. Wounds under armor were hard to reach. An arrow that failed to kill could still pin cloth, pierce flesh, or lodge in a place where every movement tore the injury wider. A lightly equipped man might move more easily but die faster. A heavily equipped man might survive longer, but suffer under the weight that kept him alive. The pila, Rome's famous heavy javelins, were nearly useless unless the enemy came close. A pilum could ruin a shield, bend on impact, and disrupt a line before the sword charge. But a horse archer outside effective range did not care how well a legionary could throw at infantry distance. Thousands of Roman weapons remained potential energy with nowhere to go. This psychological frustration mattered. Soldiers trust their equipment because equipment represents answers. At Carrhae, many Roman answers had no question to solve. The gladius was even more helpless until contact. The short sword was made for brutal work at arm's length, for stabbing around shields, cutting into bellies, thighs, faces, and arms once formations closed. Roman soldiers trained to believe that if they could reach the enemy, they could decide the matter. Surena's entire system was designed to make reaching the enemy the impossible condition. The gladius waited in its sheath while arrows did the deciding. The Parthian bow was not merely a weapon, it was a way of organizing space. Each rider carried the ability to threaten without surrendering mobility. A group of horse archers could approach one side, shoot, withdraw, and let another group take their place. They could punish pursuit by scattering. They could punish stillness by circling. They could make the Romans face everywhere, until facing everywhere meant advancing nowhere. The composite bow, the trained horse, and the rider's balance formed a single battlefield unit as integrated as any Roman shield line. This is why the camel train was so decisive. If the horse archers had carried only their own arrows, Roman endurance might have mattered more. There would have been a natural limit. Surena removed or extended that limit. The camels behind the line transformed archery from harassment into sustained operational pressure. They were not glamorous. They did not charge. They did not appear in heroic poses, but they made the killing continuous. In that sense, the camels were as important as the cataphracts. They fed the weapon that shaped the day. Roman officers had to keep men from making individually sensible but collectively fatal choices. A soldier under arrows wants to duck, shift, step back, raise his shield, lower it, run toward the shooter, or drag a wounded friend. Each impulse may make sense for one body. Formation warfare requires those impulses to be suppressed or coordinated. Centurions existed partly to turn fear back into order. At Carrhae, they were fighting two battles at once. One against the Parthians outside, and one against the natural instincts of men inside the square. The Parthians had their own discipline to maintain. A rider who came too close could die. A group that chased too eagerly might collide with Roman infantry. A cataphract charge launched too early might strike a formation still too solid to break. Arrow resupply had to avoid confusion. Horse had to be rotated before exhaustion ruined speed. Victory required restraint. Surena's men were not winning because they were wild. They were winning because they remained controlled, while making the Romans feel controlled by others. This difference between appearance and reality is one reason Roman riders struggled with mounted enemies. To a heavy infantry culture, a horseman who refuses close battle can look cowardly. To the horseman, refusing bad contact is intelligence. To the infantryman, a retreating archer looks like a man unwilling to fight. To the archer, the retreat is part of fighting. Carrhae punished Rome not only physically but conceptually. It showed that an enemy could be aggressive while moving away, decisive while avoiding decision, and courageous without standing in one place. The battle also exposed the danger of elite rivalry shaping military planning. If Crassus had been a younger commander building his career gradually, he might have accepted slower learning, but he was an old man competing with legends already alive in his own lifetime. The pressure to achieve something unmistakable mattered. A cautious campaign through Armenia, shared with allies and slowed by terrain, might have produced strategic safety but less dramatic glory. A rapid thrust into Mesopotamia promised the kind of result that could be announced in Rome with force. The road to Carrhae was paved partly with the need for a headline. Every army carries the politics of its commander. Caesar's army in Gaul carried Caesar's appetite for speed, risk, and narrative. Pompey's eastern armies had carried Pompey's taste for organization, settlement, and grand settlement making. Crassus's army carried Crassus's hunger to convert wealth into military prestige. The legions did not vote on that hunger. They marched inside it. At Carrhae, the personal ambition of one Roman became the physical environment of thousands. The Parthians understood something else. Killing the army was not the only objective. Breaking the commander's prestige mattered. Displaying Publius's head mattered. Taking standards mattered. Negotiating from dominance mattered. These were political actions expressed through battlefield events. Surena was not simply trying to reduce Roman numbers. He was constructing a defeat that Parthia could use. A dead Crassus was important. A humiliated Crassus was more important. Lost eagles were more important still because they allowed the victory to survive beyond the corpses. For Rome, the disaster became difficult to avenge because revenge required solving the same military problem. Anger could raise new armies, but anger could not make infantry faster than horses. Pride could demand restored honor, but pride could not refill water skins in Mesopotamia. The Republic and later the Empire would have to approach Parthia with more complex combinations of diplomacy, allied cavalry, careful routes, and political timing. Carrhae remained alive because it could not be erased by one immediate counterblow. The men who died there never saw the later lessons. They did not know that Augustus would one day recover the standards. They did not know that poets and historians would turn their suffering into moral argument. They did not know that modern readers would speak of tactics, logistics, and asymmetric warfare. They knew the immediate facts. The arrows were falling, the enemy would not come close, Publius had not returned, and the day was not ending quickly enough. That is the level at which the battle must finally be remembered. Not only as a grand clash between Rome and Parthia, but as an afternoon when men discovered that the training that had saved them elsewhere could not save them here, unless the battle itself changed. It did not change. Surena kept it fixed in the shape he wanted. Crassus, who had spent his life bending men through debt and influence, found himself in a place where influence had no grip. The desert did not owe him favors. The Parthian riders did not need his money. The arrows did not stop for his name. Even the silence after the battle had different meanings for each side. For Parthian riders, silence meant work after victory, recovering usable arrows, gathering horses, sorting captives, reporting losses, guarding trophies, and measuring what should be sent to the king. Victory did not erase fatigue. Men who had ridden all day still had animals to tend and wounds to bind. Servants moved among equipment. Officers counted noble riders. The army that had seemed like a storm to the Romans became, after sunset, a practical camp full of tasks. For Roman survivors, silence meant absence. The absence of units that had marched beside them, the absence of Publius, the absence of confidence in Crassus, the absence of the simple belief that a legion could force any enemy to accept its rhythm. Men who escaped would carry not only fear of Parthian arrows but a new knowledge of distance. They had learned that an enemy could remain present while refusing touch, and that refusal could be deadlier than a charge. This knowledge traveled west with them. It moved through Syria in reports, through military circles in warnings, through Rome in accusation, and eventually through history in the form of a name: Carrhae, a place few citizens had imagined before the campaign became shorthand for overreach. It meant a rich commander's ambition, a son's severed head, standards lost, arrows without end, and an army discovering too late that bravery is not the same as adaptation. Yet the most powerful image remains the day itself. A Roman army stands in the open. Shields face outward, officers shout for order, the first arrows strike. Men tell themselves the storm will pass. Then they see the camels bringing more. Publius rides out and disappears into dust. The Parthian drums continue. The sun moves slowly, water skins empty, the ground fills with shafts. Evening comes, and the living must decide whom to leave behind. No single sentence can hold Carrhae because the disaster had layers. It was Crassus's personal failure, but not only his. It was a Parthian tactical masterpiece, but not only a trick. It was a Roman military defeat, but also a political turning point. It was a story of arrows, but also of roads, rivers, heat, logistics, and pride. It was a battle in which courage appeared on both sides and still did not save the men who had chosen the wrong war in the wrong place. At dawn, after the worst of the killing, the plain near Carrhae would not have looked like a lesson. It would have looked like wreckage. Broken shields lay under dust. Dead horses stiffened in the heat. Roman helmets caught light beside bodies already stripped by victors or searched by comrades. Arrows stood in the ground at angles, some buried deep, some snapped, some still clean enough to be gathered and used again. The marks of the camel train crossed behind the Parthian positions, practical lines in the sand showing how the storm had been fed. Somewhere on that field, a Roman soldier who had survived may have pulled one arrow from his shield and kept it, not as a trophy of victory, not as a sacred relic, as evidence that Rome had reached for the east with the confidence of a conqueror and found an enemy who did not need to stand still. Evidence that an army could be brave, disciplined, and doomed by the wrong assumptions. Evidence that glory, when chased across the wrong horizon, can turn into dust before a man understands the road has already closed behind him. The survivors moved west with fewer standards, fewer friends, and a story Rome would spend decades trying to answer. Behind them, the desert kept the rest. By the time the sun rose high, the arrows still standing in the ground cast thin shadows over the place where Crassus had learned too late that the richest man in Rome could buy many things, but not the kind of battle he wanted.